Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar. I'm really happy that so many people have decided to join us today. My name is Ciaran Dodd, and I'm the Business Development Manager at Mecon. I'm just here to really introduce Ciaran, our presenter. Ciaran's worked for Mecon since 2005, delivering training courses on ASD STE for companies all around the world, like Finland, Denmark, USA, France, Germany, and all over the UK. And we always get a incredibly positive feedback from our customers from Ciaran's training. Ciaran has a background as a qualified trainer, teacher and teacher of English as a foreign language. She started her career training at Rolls-Royce, which is where she became involved in training in all aspects of writing, including STE. After leaving the organization, Ciaran set up an independent consultancy specializing in communication and learning skills, including teaching ASD STE. And this is when Mecon started working with Ciaran. She has spoken and written on STE, and last year co-authored a chapter on STE, which is currently being edited for publication. Just a few housekeeping bits before we start. If you have any questions, please put them in the question area of the GoToMeeting sessions, and we'll try and cover them at the end of the session. Other than that, I will hand over to Ciaran to do her presentation.
Thanks, Suzanne, for your welcome, and thank you everybody for joining us in this webinar this afternoon about ASD STE 100 Issue 7 2017. What's new? And I'm going to spend the next half an hour taking you through the highlights of this edition. Just a bit of background on me and STE. As you can see, 16 years and 7 issues. I was trained in 2001 by the UK member of the STE Maintenance Group. They're an important group because they are responsible for looking after updating and issuing the ASD STE 100 specification, which gives you all the rules and words that you need in order to be able to write Simplified Technical English, or STE. And as you can see there, I was trained on issue 1. Another key date is 2005. That was when AECMA Simplified English became ASD Simplified Technical English, ASD STE 100, and it was also the year that I joined Mecon. 2013 was when issue 6 was produced. It was notable because it had extensive revision to reflect the fact that more and more companies outside of aerospace and defence were using STE, and so the standard contained many changes that reflected that. And then we come up to 2017, January this year, when issue 7 was fully revised and updated and issued, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this webinar. I'm going to cover 3 key areas, and between each area I will stop and give you time to post questions if you'd like to, but I'll also have time for questions at the end. The 3 questions I'm going to answer is: who is issue 7 for? How easy is it to use issue 7? And what are some of the big changes in this issue? Before I get into what's new in issue 7, I just want to briefly explain what ASD STE 100 or STE actually is for those of you who may not be familiar with it. This is the definition from the specification. ASD STE is an international specification for the preparation of technical documentation in a controlled language. The keywords I have highlighted in bold. It's an international specification. That means it is a complete and documented way of writing in a controlled language. It's used for technical documentation. We'll come to the significance of that later. And it is to be written in controlled English. What do we mean by controlled English? From my long experience of reading technical English, it tends to be uncontrolled in the sense that it uses complex grammar, regularly has long sentences, uses many words with the same meaning or single words with many meanings, and you often have inconsistency of terms. When we talk about a controlled language like STE, it's almost the exact opposite. The rules of STE and the words that you are allowed to use together require you to write using a simplified grammar. For example, the verbs that you can use are heavily restricted. You need to write in short sentences, and the sentence length is specified. You have approved vocabulary that you must use. That's partly in the dictionary, and also it allows you to add your own terms. The words that are chosen have one word with one meaning. You have to be consistent with the terms that you use, and the rules drive structure into your writing at paragraph and sentence level. What are the benefits of writing in ASD STE 100 or STE? That could be a whole webinar in itself, but for this I'm just going to summarize some of these key benefits. The first thing that I've already talked about is the fact that it makes your texts simpler and easier to read, which was the philosophy behind the original edition of Simplified English in 1986. If your texts are clear and unambiguous, then where you're in safety critical industries like aerospace, it means that technicians who don't necessarily speak English as a second language can properly understand, for example, maintenance tasks and therefore perform their duties correctly. Aerospace also requires the use of STE 100 in standards like, for example, ATA I2200, and also S1000D requires STE. I've also mentioned that STE, because it controls the paragraphs, the sentences that you write, it provides structure at paragraph and sentence level. Where you are using structured authoring, that specifies how you need to build the modules for your document, but structured authoring doesn't get down to the level of precision that you need to put into your sentences and paragraphs, and that's what STE can give you. In aerospace, you don't translate your documents, but where you do, STE can help because it means that the source information that is used for translation is precise, concise, clear, and tends to lead to better quality and cost-effective translations. The final benefit is that where you are collaborating to produce your technical documentation, perhaps you have input from subject matter experts, maybe you outsource your technical documentation to a separate company, and you've got quality assurers that need to check the quality of the documentation. It's very easy where there are lots of people involved for personal preferences and personal styles to creep into your technical documentation and to become obvious to the reader. So by using the STE standard, everyone is working to the same requirements, and therefore you're more likely to get consistent and clear documentation. So now that we've defined what STE is, we're going to go to the first question, which is, who is issue 7 for? As I said, Simplified English, as was developed in 1986 after the airlines in the aerospace industry asked for a standard that would make maintenance documentation easy for non-native English users to understand. After studying maintenance documents and collaboration amongst various aerospace companies, AECMA Simplified English was born. In truth, the standard that we have now, issue 7, is very similar to what was in the 1986 standard, other than, as I mentioned earlier, it's been amended in the issues since 1986 to show that other industries besides aerospace and defence are using STE, and the standard has been amended to reflect that over the passage of 30 years. And yes, this is me standing next to a world record breaking tractor on one of my courses in Finland 2 years ago. What makes issue 7 so different, for me particularly, having watched it since 2002, is the fact that this is the first standard that openly declares that STE can be used by anyone, or as Orlando Chiarello, chairman of the maintenance group, puts it, the specification is universally applicable, as in fact it, meaning STE, already is. And to show that, they have changed the subtitle of the specification from International Specification for the Preparation of Maintenance Documentation to the more general technical documentation to reflect this universally applicable principle that they've officially declared in issue 7. And issue 7 seems to be proving quite popular, as these Facebook posts from the maintenance group show, bearing in mind that the issue was published at the end of January. So as of a couple of weeks ago, they had issued 600 copies of the specification. They noted that 65% of the copies requested were from companies or organisations outside of aerospace and defence, and they felt they needed to outpost this request from McLaren. That's a course I'd love to do because I like my Formula One, so I'm hoping that that might come our way. So in summary, who is issue 7 for? Well, potentially now it's from anyone, it's for anyone from any industry with the correct training, of course. So I'll pause for a few seconds while you just put in any questions that you might have before we move on to part 2. So the second question I'm going to address is, how easy is it to use issue 7? As I suggested in the first part, because the specification is 30 years old, and because it has evolved over various issues, and at each issue words have changed, some rules have changed, some of the examples have changed, some of the categories of words have changed. By the time we got to issue 6, you had to be quite experienced with the specification to be able to easily follow the flow and to work out how the words and the dictionary work together to create controlled English. What I think is brilliant about issue 7 is that the maintenance group have spent the last 4 years looking at all the feedback that they've received and input from other people like academics and translators, for example. And they looked at the whole specification, stripped it right back to basics, and they've basically rewritten the specification, recognizing this universal principle, updating it with technology and other elements of industry that have changed since the standard was first produced in 1986. And I think that the new standard is streamlined, it's user-friendly, it's much easier to navigate, and I think it's more accessible to everyone, which should result in STE that's reliable and consistent. For example, they've streamlined the writing rules. Originally there were 65, but that's now down to 53. They've merged some rules and they've removed others. They've added clear explanations and improved a lot of the examples, for example, some of them in section 1 on words. So this is an excerpt from section 1, and you can see that they've put headings in which weren't there before in previous issues. The rule itself is in a coloured panel, which makes it much more easy to see the rule as you flick through the specification. Underneath you've got clearer explanations with examples that have been reformatted, and as I say, as you go through they're much clearer than they were in previous editions. As I said, because they've gone back and looked at the whole specification, there's a better flow throughout the specification as you use it. I've talked about the highlighted panels. And the other big thing that's changed is that although the text is not in simplified technical English completely, the style that's now in the specification is much more consistent with STE principles. So collectively, that's made the writing rules in section 1 much easier to follow and understand. The dictionary also has had a makeover. There's a new format. They've revised words, removed words, amended definitions, and as it says there, where possible, replaced aeronautical examples with other more universal ones. And I've got an example here. This is just a page I took from issue 6. So you can see there are 4 columns, but it's quite hard in cases to see which example belongs to which key word. And if you look at the definition, you've got aircraft here. To park the aircraft refer to step 1, so still very aerospace focused. This is the same page from issue 7. I like the fact that they've put the lines here because it makes it much easier to see which examples relate to which key word. They've redefined park to use vehicle instead of aircraft, and you'll see that the approved examples reads park the car instead of park the aircraft. So it's an example of how they've gone through the whole specification and made it what they call universally applicable. So to answer the question, how easy is it to use issue 7? I think it's a much easier specification for people to use, particularly people who are new to it and need to learn their way around it in order to write in STE. And as it says here, STE itself hasn't changed, and to be honest, if you looked at issue 7 and looked at issue 1 that I started on 16 years ago, you'd see that an awful lot of the principles are the same. What's different is that they've simplified and explained the writing rules and reformatted the standard, which has made it much more user-friendly. I'll take a short pause while you write any questions you might have. So now I'm just going to briefly outline some of the key changes, the big changes in the specification. There aren't many changes in the STE itself, as I say, because the principles have remained largely the same. One notable change is section 7. This is from the new standard. Section 7 used to be called warnings, cautions and notes because that's how they were referred to in the aerospace industry. Whenever I did training with organisations outside of aerospace, this was one section where we used to have quite a lot of debate because a lot of industries have their own conventions for labelling hazards in documents, and they didn't fit with the rules in STE that were aerospace focused. So what the maintenance group have done in this issue, which I think is a big step forward to making it universally applicable, is, as you can see here, they've said safety instructions tell readers that procedures or steps can be dangerous, but they explicitly include different words or categories for safety instructions from other industries. What you need to do is to try and follow the rules, which they've simplified here, But ultimately what this does is it means that you either use the aerospace definitions, if that's where you're from, or you now have the STE permission to use your own conventions as long as you use the STE principles as much as possible. And that's summarised in this slide here. I've already mentioned sections 1 and 2. These are important sections on which words you can use and the noun clusters where you've got several nouns together. These two sections were not always as clear as they could be when we were talking about which words you can use and some of the principles around that. As you can see, they've restricted the number of rules on the words that you can use from 17 to 14, and that is much clearer than it was before. It's also easier, I think, now to understand the 3 categories of approved words and how you make words technical names or technical verbs using the categories in section 1. And the principle on how to deal with technical names that are clusters of 3 nouns is also much easier to understand. The other area that's often tricky to understand when you're starting with STE, but is vitally important, as I said, is the use of the verb forms, which are restricted in STE. Again, they are much clearer. And the only sort of change here is that although the rule on the ing form of the verb is the same in that you can't use it, what they have added, which was often a talking point in training, is that you can use the ing form of the verb as part of a technical name. That was the same as before, but what they've added is that in titles and procedures you can use the ing form of the verb as the heading of a task. So that's a new addition, and I know there are some companies that I've trained where this was an issue, so that makes things a little bit easier. So to conclude, we've looked at who is issue 7 for, and as I said, the big change in issue 7 is that STE is now for anyone with training, because it explicitly recognises that people outside aerospace and defence use STE, and the specification now supports that. We've also asked how easy is it to use issue 7, and as I say, because of the thorough revision of the rules, the vocabulary, the layout and the writing style, I think this is a much more user-friendly and streamlined version of the specification. But you still need to be able to apply the rules correctly and use the correct words to get the full benefit of STE. And finally, we've summarised some of the big changes in the new specification. I've talked about the subtitle change, the rules on safety instructions, the fact that they've streamlined the rules, explanations and examples, and the fact, for me, the biggest change for me is the fact that STE is now for universal application. So next steps really, I've got some questions here which I will deal with now. A request from us, we'd like to know about your STE experiences to help us develop our training for issue 7, and Munya will be in contact with you after the webinar to find out more about that. And if you've got questions, more detailed questions, or you would like some information about training, you can contact Suzanne or I with the information on the last slide. So the questions that we've had, one of the questions was about the difference between plain language and simplified technical English. Plain English is less strict than simplified technical English. They share common principles, I would say. Plain English requires shorter sentences, the use of the active voice, to use familiar language. The difference with STE is that it takes those principles but it makes them much more precise and it mandates them for your writing. So that would be the difference between the two. I've had another question about a warning, and if you would change the warning and put it into the aerospace form with warnings, cautions and notes. When I used to train on that before this issue, we used to look at keeping to your conventions. If your industry had its own conventions for writing warnings and safety instructions, you can't change those. If that's what your industry requires, then you have to work with those, but as they've done in issue 7, we used to say, but try and work with the principles of STE as much as you can. STE's now formalized what we used to say in the training, and so ultimately you have to follow the requirements of your industry for your warnings and cautions. They're important, and so I would always say follow what you're required to do in your industry, but if you can apply the STE principles to the content of your warnings and cautions, then it can be helpful to do so. There was a question about the addition of ing in the titles, and if you've already started to create titles without the ing form, what's my view? Personally, I think there's a good reason not to use the ing form or the gerund, because it can be misleading exactly what purpose the ing form is performing in a sentence. And so in training on previous issues, I would have said if you can, try and format your titles using the verb in the command form, so either to replace X, or to replace X, do the following. They've allowed the ing form in the titles, but personally speaking, my view is still the same as it was in the previous issues, and I would seek to avoid using the ing form in the titles if you can. I think that's all the questions for now, so I'd like to say thank you for your time this afternoon, and if you've got any questions, do please get in touch with us. Thank you.